America's biggest industrial blow of 2025 didn't come from overseas rivals. It began quietly at home, where factory floors in Ohio went dark before the workday ended and forklifts in Kentucky stood abandoned. In Detroit, unfinished pickup trucks lined assembly lots, waiting for parts that never arrived. What looked like a minor trade quarrel has torn through supply chains with alarming speed, unraveling decades of industrial strength. If the spiral continues, entire regions could lose the industries that once defined them, leaving millions to question what their hard-earned skills are really worth in the new economy. The announcement landed on a Tuesday, the kind of day that would be remembered as the moment America's industrial foundation began to shake. Canada's Ministry of International Trade issued a statement that sounded calm, wrapped in the careful language of diplomacy. Yet beneath the surface, its message was devastating. All aluminum imports from specified sources would face new regulatory reviews and potential suspensions. Within hours, markets convulsed. Aluminum prices on the London Metal Exchange jumped 23% in a single session, the sharpest rise in more than 15 years. On Wall Street, the numbers looked like statistics. On factory floors across the Midwest, they meant shutdowns, layoffs, and production lines frozen in place. At a parts plant near Toledo, Supervisor Maria Santos stared at the machines, grinding to a halt for the second time that week. She told her manager there were maybe 3 days of material left, then the doors would close and workers would be sent home. She was not alone. General Motors announced slowdowns at 4 plants. Ford postponed the release of its next pickup truck. Tesla, which had boasted of diversified supply chains, quietly began rationing aluminum for its Cybert truck line. The damage went well beyond cars. Boeing discovered that more than half of its aerospace-grade aluminum came from sources now trapped in regulatory uncertainty. Lockheed Martin faced shortages that threatened to delay missile programs. The Pentagon F-35 fighter jet, already criticized for delays and cost overruns, confronted its most dangerous supply bottleneck yet. Analysts warned that aerospace-grade aluminum cannot be replaced overnight. Certification takes months. Scaling new suppliers can take years. In the meantime, production gaps would stretch well into the next year. The crisis was rippling outward faster than anyone had predicted. Power plants in the Midwest reported declines in electricity demand as factories slowed operations. Utility companies issued discreet warnings to investors about shrinking industrial consumption. In Ohio, Alcoa announced possible shutdowns at its smelter. In Texas, Century Aluminum began sending second-shift workers home. These were not temporary layoffs. They were early signs of an industrial system beginning to unravel. And while factories across America scrambled for substitutes, events 500 meters to the north revealed a different reality. Canada was not caught off guard. Ottawa had been preparing for years. And now its plan unfolded with precision. Quebec's industrial leaders were not reacting to crisis. They were executing a strategy that had been built in silence, waiting for the right moment. At Rio Tinto's facility in Alma, plant manager Jean-Luc stood before monitors, flashing near-perfect efficiency rates. Production was running at 98% capacity. Ingots moved steadily toward destinations in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. 2 years earlier, most of it would have been shipped south across the border. Now, the contracts stretched far into the future, booked solid through 2027. The transformation was sweeping. The European Union alone signed agreements for 2.4 million tons of Quebec aluminum each year, an increase of more than threefold compared to pre-crisis levels. Japan's Mitsubishi Heavy Industries locked in a 7-year deal worth $3.2 billion. South Korea's POSCO committed to deliveries extending into 2029. These were not emergency purchases from desperate buyers. They were deliberate long-term partnerships. Quebec's advantage was rooted in something America could not match. Its smelters were powered by vast hydroelectric grids, making production nearly carbon neutral. European regulators imposed steep taxes on high-emission aluminum, charging $180 per ton. Quebec's output with emissions 85% lower than coal-powered operations slipped through tariff-free and even earned premiums for its green credentials. American producers, weighed down by higher costs and carbon penalties, had no answer. The strategy extended beyond buyers. Canada built the infrastructure to bypass U.S. transport networks entirely. The Port of Quebec launched a $2.8 to $8 billion expansion with deep water bursts designed for massive cargo vessels, automated loading systems that shaved 40% off port times, and dedicated rail lines connecting smelters directly to shipping lanes. The message was unmistakable. Quebec's aluminum would reach Hamburg, Osaka, or Busan without relying on a single American mile of rail or road. Dependence on U.S. routes, a vulnerability for decades, was now gone. And aluminum was only the beginning. The same infrastructure would carry lithium from new mines, rare earth minerals from expanded operations, and green technology products destined for global markets. Economists described it as sovereignty built with steel and concrete, a structural independence designed to outlast temporary disputes. Ottawa was not winning a single trade fight. It was engineering a permanent shift in continental power. Back in the United States, the second shock arrived within 6 weeks. 3 major aluminum smelters cut production. Century Aluminum's plant in Hawville, Kentucky, silent since its founding in 1978, closed its doors. In Missouri, Nanda furloughed 800 workers. Alcoa's Tennessee operations dropped to 60% capacity. Workers watched their livelihoods disappear while explanations about global competition rang hollow. Operators with decades of experience knew the truth. Customers had turned north, drawn by cheaper power, stable policies, and contracts backed by clean energy. The math was brutal. Quebec smelters operated on electricity costs 40% lower than American facilities. That translated into hundreds of dollars per ton in savings. Downstream industries faced devastating consequences. Automotive suppliers lost international bids because their aluminum costs ran a quarter higher than competitors. Aerospace manufacturers watched rivals secure stable deliveries while their own schedules fell into uncertainty. Construction companies saw projects grind to a halt. Aluminum window frames, roofing materials, and structural supports became scarce. Housing development slowed. Commercial buildings were postponed indefinitely. Officials in Michigan warned the crisis was eroding not only jobs but entire sectors of expertise. Once those skills and industries shifted north, they would not return easily. Evidence of that migration was already visible. Engineers and metallurgical specialists from shuttered American plants received offers from Quebec companies with higher salaries and relocation incentives. Bombardier's aerospace division in Montreal reported an influx of applications from workers who had built careers at Boeing, Lockheed, and General Dynamics. These were not only employees, but carriers of specialized knowledge that had taken decades to refine. The transfer of talent accelerated Quebec's momentum, reinforcing its dominance as American capacity shrank. The most painful truth was that this was not a single industry issue. Aluminum was only the first move in a broader strategy. While Washington focused on short-term trade leverage, Ottawa assembled the foundation of a complete industrial reordering. Inside the Pentagon, the scale of the problem came into focus during classified briefings. Defense officials reviewed the damage with growing alarm. Aluminum made up a small fraction of total consumption, but aerospace-grade aluminum was irreplaceable in national defense. Fighter jets, missile systems, naval ships, and satellites all required it. 60% of America's supply had been flowing from Quebec. Military contractors could not simply swap in lower-grade material. Specifications were exacting, and certification for new suppliers took years. The consequences were immediate. The F-35 program faced new delays that risked billions in additional costs. The Navy reviewed specifications for its destroyer program. The Air Force conducted emergency assessments for bomber modernization. At the same time, NATO allies secured multi-year deals with Quebec. Germany's defense ministry partnered with Rio Tinto's Quebec operations for 1.8 billion euros. France's Dal Aviation signed an exclusive contract for next-generation fighters. The United Kingdom's BAE Systems secured deliveries through 2030. Yet Canada was positioning itself as the arsenal supplier for democratic allies, while America paid the price of its own trade decisions. Analysts pointed out the irony. Tariffs intended to protect U.S. producers had reinforced Canada's rise. Ottawa used the moment to strengthen its leverage. Canadian officials informed Washington that defense exports would continue, but at premium prices reflecting market conditions and the need for supply chain security. NATO allies who signed long-term partnerships paid less, while America, with its short-term approach, paid more. The meaning was clear. Canada, America's neighbor and closest ally, no longer played the role of silent partner, willing to absorb the costs of U.S. policy. It was stepping forward as an industrial power in its own right, using aluminum as the wedge that shifted the balance of economic and military supply across the continent. And while Washington debated the politics of tariffs, an irreversible transformation was already underway. But the aluminum crisis was revealing something even more troubling about America's industrial strategy. For years, leaders in Washington had believed that physical proximity to Canadian resources guaranteed stability. That assumption was collapsing in real time. Quebec was no longer simply a supplier of raw metal. It was exporting something far more valuable. Reliable energy, environmentally compliant production, political stability, and cutting-edge industrial capacity, all woven into one package. No combination of American incentives or subsidies could match it. Defense contractors that once relied heavily on U.S. suppliers were now reluctantly signing multi-year agreements with Quebec, acknowledging that the playing field had changed for good. The aluminum shock was no temporary storm. It was the opening stage of a permanent recalibration of North American industrial relations. The real question was no longer about endurance, but about adaptation. Whether American industry could adjust to a reality in which its northern neighbor controlled leverage that tariffs and politics could not neutralize. And Quebec was not stopping with aluminum. It was building something larger, an interconnected industrial system that threatened to sideline entire sectors of U.S. manufacturing. While American factories scrambled for aluminum, Quebec was executing the next move in a carefully prepared strategy. The billions in contracts that had poured into the province were not isolated wins. They were the foundation for a comprehensive clean technology supply chain that would make Quebec a cornerstone of the global green economy. At the Northvolt battery plant in McMasterville, engineers worked across production lines where every component came from within a few hundred miles. Lithium was sourced from nearby mines. Aluminum rolled in from regional smelters and nickel arrived from Sudbury. This was not simple assembly work. It was a demonstration that an entire clean energy system could be built and maintained within a single integrated region. The scale of the transformation was staggering. Lithium output had climbed by nearly 250% in less than 2 years. Battery production capacity was expanding at a pace few believe possible. And electric vehicle component exports had nearly doubled year over year. Behind it all stood Quebec's hydroelectric electric grid, one of the largest in the world, now expanding further to feed the energy-hungry transition to green technology. Projects in James Bay alone promised an additional 12,000 megawatt of clean generation, more than enough to power the region's industrial shift. Quebec was not offering low-cost production alone. It was offering carbon-neutral manufacturing at scale, something no American industrial center could match. The numbers left little room for denial. Electric vehicle batteries produced in Quebec carried roughly 70% fewer emissions than those made in U.S. states still relying on fossil fuel electricity. With international carbon standards increasingly shaping global trade, that environmental edge translated into real market access and higher pricing power. What started as a narrow trade move quickly reshaped the global energy race. Quebec no longer played the role of a regional supplier. It stepped onto the world stage as a rising industrial force. The warning from experts was clear. Power in the modern economy doesn't come from size or influence alone. It demands clean energy innovation, advanced technology, and supply chains built to withstand shocks. So, can America adjust fast enough to hold its ground? Or is the future already tilting toward its northern neighbor? For more breakdowns like this, don't forget to subscribe.